You might be surprised to learn that the Quran treats Jesus with an attention and honor that many modern readers don't expect, yet it also insists on things Christians would find jarring. He is not divine, he did not become God's literal son, and the story of his death is told very differently. What does the Quran actually say about Jesus? In this video, we'll unpack the surprising truths the Quran offers, the titles and honors it gives him, the miracle stories it preserves, its sharp theological disagreements with Christian doctrine, the controversial verses about the crucifixion, the role Jesus plays in Islamic eschatology, and how mystics within Islam read him. Along the way, I'll point you to the specific Quranic verses so you can read them for yourself. To begin, a quick historical anchor. Islam emerges in the early 7th century CE in an environment already saturated with Jewish and Christian stories, oral traditions and written gospels, canonical and non-canonical. The Quran addresses the people of the book, al-Kitab, presupposing knowledge of earlier scriptures and debates. That is why many Quranic references to Jesus can sound like responses to existing Christian claims, or as if they preserve alternative versions of stories circulating in the region. This background helps explain both the Quran's praise for Jesus and the forcefulness with which it challenges Christian theological conclusions. If you enjoy clear, fair takes on religion and want more videos like this, go ahead and subscribe. I'll do deeper dives on specific passages if there's interest. So let's walk through the main things the Quran says about Jesus, starting with how it names and honors him. In Surah 345, Al-Imran, the angels announce to Mary the birth of a word from him and identify the child as the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, Al-Mashiach, Isa ibn Maryam. The Quran repeatedly calls him Al-Mashiach, the Messiah, and repeatedly identifies him as the son of Mary, a patronymic, Ibn Maryam, that emphasizes his maternal lineage and the miraculous nature of his birth. Another distinctive title the Quran uses is Kalimat Allah, a word from God, and it also refers to him as a spirit from God. See Surah 4:171. These are high honorific expressions. The Quran classifies Jesus among God's specially commissioned messengers and frames his birth and mission as signs, ayat, of divine power. But the honorifics come with a twist. While the Quran honors Jesus, it stops short of any claim that he is divine. One of the Quran's central theological moves is to defend strict monotheism. God is uniquely one, without partners or offspring. Verses such as Surah 112, Al-Ikhlas, he begets not, nor is he begotten, and explicit admonitions in passages like Surah 4:171 caution Christians against calling God by human categories such as son.
The Quran stages a theological polemic. It affirms Jesus as a prophet and messenger endowed with signs, yet it rejects the idea that God's nature or being can be described in father-son language. In Surah 5:116, the Quran even depicts a divine dialogue that underscores this point. God questions Jesus about whether he told people to worship him and his mother. The implied answer is negative, and the dialogue functions as a corrective to understandings that elevate Jesus or Mary to objects of worship. Next, the miracle stories. The Quran accepts a number of miracles attributed to Jesus, some of which will sound familiar to Christians and others that recall extra-canonical tales. In Surah 5:110, God reminds the community of the favors bestowed upon Jesus, speaking as an infant to defend his mother, creating a living bird from clay and breathing life into it, healing the blind and lepers, and raising the dead, all described as signs by God. The clay birds episode in particular mirrors incidents found in early Christian apocryphal infancy gospels, such as the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, where a child Jesus fashions birds from clay and gives them life. The presence of similar motifs across traditions is historically intriguing. Scholars debate whether the Quran is borrowing from popular oral or written apocrypha, whether both drew on older shared traditions, or whether there is a complex mixing of sources. The safe claim is that the parallels are real and that they show how the Quran interacts with a broader cultural memory about Jesus' infancy and miracles. Now we reach what often surprises people most, the tension between exaltation and polemic. The Quran praises Jesus in language Christians recognize, Messiah, Word of God, bearer of signs, and yet it repeatedly denies that Jesus is God's son in any ontological sense. Surah 4:171 summarizes the Quranic challenge succinctly. While affirming Jesus' prophethood and the miracle of his birth, it warns against claiming that God is three or that God has a son. The Quran's theological concern is not merely academic, it is polemical and pastoral. It assumes that worship must be directed to God alone and confronts what it sees as theological innovations that risk associating partners with the divine. That opposition becomes most visible in the Quran's treatment of the crucifixion. Surah 4:157-158 famously denies in strong terms that they killed killed him nor crucified him, but it was made to appear to them. Classical Muslim exegesis treats this passage in multiple ways, and it's essential to stress that there is no single unanimous Islamic interpretation. Here are the principal lines of reading found in the exegetical tradition. One influential reading is the substitution or apparent crucifixion theory.
According to some classical commentators, God made it appear that Jesus was crucified, while in reality, someone else, various names are suggested in different traditions, including Judas in some narratives, was made to resemble him and bore the suffering. Under this view, Jesus was spared humiliation and death and was taken up by God. Another major reading emphasizes elevation. God raised Jesus unto himself, as Surah 4:158 also says, which some interpreters understand to mean that God saved Jesus from death. The divine action, not a human resurrection narrative, is decisive. A third set of readings sees the verse as focused less on historical detail and more on correcting theological claims. The Quran denies the theological assertion that Jesus' crucifixion proves his divine sonship, or that the crucifixion is the final, defining act by which people should base their worship. Modern scholars have also proposed that the Quranic language may reflect a polemical refrain against specific Christian claims circulating in Arabia at the time, or against certain interpretations of the crucifixion. Whatever the preference, the exegetical landscape remains plural and contested. The Quran clearly rejects the theological import Christians traditionally derive from the crucifixion, while the exact historical reconstruction of the event is treated differently across Islamic traditions. If you're tracking the sources, note that the Quran itself does not narrate the Gospel Passion story in the sequential way the New Testament does. Rather, Surah 4:157-158 makes an emphatic theological denial. The Hadith literature and later tafsir, exegesis, carry much of the detailed narrative work in Muslim tradition, and these later texts introduce further possibilities and variations. Because of this diversity, it's important not to present one Muslim view as representing the whole of Islamic thought. The Quran also projects Jesus forward into the future. While the Quranic text itself does not elaborate a fully developed eschatology about Jesus, Islamic tradition, especially the Hadith corpus, develops a powerful image of Jesus' return. In many Sunni and Shia Hadiths, Jesus, Isa, returns near the end of time to defeat the Dajjal, the Antichrist figure, to restore justice and to live out a reign of righteousness. He is said to kill the Dajjal, break the cross, and correct mistaken beliefs. That narrative has become central in popular Muslim eschatology. Yet scholars caution that the precise role, timing, and even identity in these traditions can vary. Some groups emphasize a literal, physical return of the historical Jesus. Others offer symbolic or typological readings, interpreting the return as the advent of a messianic figure or a moral spiritual revival, rather than a literal second coming. Sunni and Shia traditions also differ in emphasis. For instance, the figure of al-Mahdi plays a more central role in Shia expectations, and regional folk beliefs have shaped popular imaginations about these events. What is clear is that within Islamic thought, Jesus remains an eschatological agent, expected to correct error and establish justice, even as the precise contours of that expectation are debated. Another set of lenses is provided by Sufism, Islamic mysticism, which reads Jesus not primarily as a doctrinal problem to be solved, but as an exemplar of asceticism and divine intimacy. Sufi commentators and poets often elevate Jesus as a model of renunciation, spiritual poverty, faqr, and ecstatic union with God. Figures like Al-Ghazali, c. 1058-1111, who wrote prolifically on repentance, prayer, and the inner life, treats prophets, including Jesus, as exemplars for the soul's journey. Ibn Arabi, 1165-1240, one of the most influential mystical thinkers, goes even further in certain passages, attributing to Jesus a high metaphysical status as a locus of divine manifestation, a view that classical legalists might find extravagant. These Sufi readings emphasize Jesus' inwardness, his detachment from worldly power, his exemplary poverty, and his perfection as a spiritual human. Such perspectives show that within Islam, Jesus can be admired not only as a law-bringing prophet, but as a symbol of the soul's longing for God. Two more points are important for a rounded view. First, the Quran's narratives about Jesus show lines of contact with non-canonical Christian texts. The Proto-Evangelium of James and the Infant Gospel of Thomas are apocryphal writings that preserved stories about Mary's virginity, Jesus' miraculous infancy, and unusual childhood episodes.
The similarities between some Quranic stories, notably the infancy miracles, and these apocryphal themes have led many scholars to propose a shared cultural pool of stories, perhaps circulating orally in late antique Syria, Palestine, and Arabia. Whether the Quran drew directly from apocrypha, from oral traditions that also circulated among Christians, or from common regional memories is debated. The only secure conclusion is that the Quranic Jesus is in conversation with a rich and variegated set of narratives that were not limited to the canonical New Testament. Second, the Quran's presentation of Jesus must be read on its own terms. It operates with its own theological categories and polemical aims. Where Christianity developed doctrines like the Trinity and the Incarnation in specific historical and philosophical contexts, the Quran responds by defending Tawhid, the uncompromising unity of God, and by reframing Jesus' significance within that framework. In other words, the Quran's affirmations and denials make coherent sense within an internal logic governed by monotheism as Islam understands it.
How do these threads converge into the surprising truths promised at the start? There are two principal surprises. First, the Quran honors Jesus far more than many viewers assume. He is Messiah, given miraculous signs, the subject of an annunciation and of many narratives that treat him as an extraordinary figure in God's economy. Second, the Quran does all this while vigorously rejecting any form of deification or filial language applied to God. The apparent paradox, exaltation on the one hand, denial of divinity on the other, resolves when we see that the Quran praises Jesus as a preeminent prophet whose life and miracles testify to God's power, while simultaneously using those very testimonies to argue for a purer understanding of God's uniqueness. Why does this matter for interfaith conversations today? First, it challenges simplistic assumptions. Knowing the Quran's admiration for Jesus can temper the idea that Islam erases Jesus or treats him as unimportant. Likewise, understanding the Quran's theological objections to Christian doctrines can clarify why historical Muslim-Christian polemics were intense and why some debates persist. Second, it opens a pathway for more nuanced dialogue. Christians and Muslims can acknowledge common reverence for Jesus while honestly discussing theological differences, rather than reducing the conversation to caricature. Finally, familiarizing oneself with the diversity within Islamic interpretation, legalist tafsir, popular hadith narratives, and mystical Sufi readings prevents treating Islam as a single monolithic voice. If you want to explore the primary texts, start with these Quranic passages: Surah 3, 42 through 45, Annunciation and Titles, Surah 19, 16 through 36, the story of Mary and Jesus' birth, Surah 5, 110, Miracles, Surah 4, 157 through 158, Crucifixion verse, and Surah 61, 6, Jesus announcing a messenger after him. For classical interpretations, look at tafsir collections such as those by Al-Tabari and Ibn Kathir, and for accessible modern translations, try M.A.S. Abdul Halim or Muhammad Asad. For study of apocryphal parallels, consult editions and translations of the Proto-Evangelium of James and the Infant Gospel of Thomas, and for a focused modern study on Islamic portrayals of Jesus, Tarif Khalidi's The Muslim Jesus is a helpful starting point. If you are curious about mystical perspectives, read selections from Al-Ghazali, c. 1058 to 1111, on the inner life, and Ibn Arabi, 1165 to 1240, for the more metaphysical Sufi approach. Keep in mind that many scholarly debates remain open. Where the evidence is suggestive but not decisive, historians mark those connections as plausible or contested rather than certain. Before we close, a few final reflections.
The Quranic portrait of Jesus invites us to see religious texts as participants in a conversation across time and communities. The Quran affirms Jesus' prophetic greatness while insisting on a theological reinterpretation shaped by its central commitment to divine unity. That double move, high praise conjoined with decisive theological correction, is why the Quran's presentation of Jesus can feel both familiar to Christians and radically different at once. Appreciating that duality helps create a more honest and constructive interfaith conversation. Which of these facts surprised you the most? The Quran's honorific titles, the infancy miracles, the denial of traditional crucifixion narratives, the prophetic announcement of a future messenger, or the Sufi admiration of Jesus as a spiritual exemplar? Tell us in the comments. And if you'd like a follow-up, say whether you want a deep dive into the crucifixion verse within classical tafsir or a full episode on Sufi readings of Jesus. I'll put a list of the key verses and suggested readings in the description so you can read them yourself. Thanks for watching, and if you found this helpful, like the video and consider subscribing for more balanced explorations of religious texts and traditions.